And it is my duty to introduce our next speaker for the afternoon. And again, somebody from the stall of Otto Kreuzfeld, Professor Ernst Pöppel, who is our longtime friend here in Singapore, because Ernst is now our returning ghost every other month. He is our very, very regular visitor, and he helped shape many things here, even in this conference and the discussions around the whole series of this Good Life Research conference series. So Ernst is a psychologist, a cognitive psychologist, and again, he is a person who has a long list of original game-changing discoveries. He is one of the discoverer of blind sight and several other perceptual and perceptual cognitive conditions, disorders, dispositions, and so on. But let's give the word to Ernst and not waste the time with my nonsense talk.
So thank you very much for the introduction. Now I have to get adjusted to this. Yes. So some 50 years ago, I started to learn science, and I worked in the field of chronobiology. And what I still remember is that the worst time to give a lecture is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So everybody is tired, and so we try anyway, right? So the quotation, learning from the East. Yeah? Confucius said, when you are 70 years old, you can do what you want. So I'm using this privilege. And at this talk, I will only ask questions. There are no answers, okay? So many years ago, some 30 years ago, I was on an airplane from Tokyo to Singapore, and I was sitting next to a gentleman, and it turned out to be Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore. And for several hours, I got an introduction to politics, so how to do it. And so, as he said, I'm always correct, but not necessarily politically correct. So that is my relation, actually, emotional relation also, Singapore. Well, the two gentlemen who organized here this meeting have some affiliations to somebody from Hungary and somebody from the Netherlands. Yeah? And so on the right, you see János Szentagotay, who was the teacher of several people here. And he was actually my fatherly friend when I was at MIT. He always told me to work harder. Unfortunately, I did not do it. The other one is Vale Nauta, eminent neuroanatomist. And they had actually a little strange relationship. Nauta called Szentagotay the last romanticist in neuroanatomy. So now I talk about single cases. And single case studies do not have a good reputation right now. If you want to publish a paper, certain journals reject single case studies to begin with. However, one should remember that quite a lot of insight in the neurosciences and cognitive science came from single case studies, starting in the 60s of the 19th century with Broca and his patient Tintin, or to take Henry M., or to take other cases. So I'm going to present 7 case studies, short, and I try to, with, well, how do you say that, the command to inject other ideas, not only science. So maybe there's some science in my talk, but I don't know how much. Yeah. And only questions, no answers. So the example one is constancy of brightness throughout the visual field. A lot of talks, most talks were relating to cortex, cortical structures. And I'm practically only talking about the early visual pathway. So the idea is that in order to have a representation of content, you must have some kind of machinery below. And so this, and it starts as the retina. So first example on this here. Exactly 100 years ago, Malevich painted this black square, which became an icon in the arts. And if we think about what is actually represented in the retina, it's just surfaces with different colors or brightness and edges. There are no lines. So the riddle for me is, how is it possible that everybody in this room probably has the impression that there is a black rectangle which has a homogeneous brightness? This is actually, should be impossible, because if one measures the light, the threshold to detect targets in the visual field, and this is shown here with the first single case study by a person with the initials EP, that happens to be myself. Many years ago at MIT, we studied in detail the threshold sensitivity under photopic adaptation conditions, and you see here, this is from 60 degrees nasal visual field to 90 or 85 degrees temporal visual field. The sensitivity and the operation range is 2.5 log units. So the fovea has the highest intensity, then it goes down up to 10 degrees eccentricity approximately. Then you have some kind of a plateau of equal sensitivity, and it goes down to the periphery. And if one constructs this two-dimensionally, this is, by the way, the standard eye of American ophthalmology, coming from a German scientist, so it's the right eye. This is the sensitivity, highest sensitivity of the fovea, and these are isopters, so lines of equal sensitivity surrounding the foveal axis. Let me make a technical comment. There's nothing more stupid than a laser pointer, because it does not guide the eye. What you see is, oh, he's trembling. You do not know. A classical stick actually was guiding, leading the eye. So one has to come back to Star Wars. Obi-Wan Kenobi, he had this laser pointer where you could see actually where the next movement is going. Okay, so this is a standard eye. Now, what one observes, so the sensitivity goes down. Now, if one does the following, however, now I've turned the ordinate around, highest sensitivity, the lowest threshold here at the foveal axis. This is a binocular distribution, so it's going, sensitivity is going down. This is what we measure. But then when we measure the apparent brightness across the visual field, one observes that the apparent brightness is independent of the threshold. So the distance here is much larger than other areas. So there's something strange going on. This is the threshold distribution. Sensitivity goes down, but in the suprathreshold domain, there's equal brightness. Now, if one takes this now, one has to somehow understand what that means, right? So I redraw it here, the foveal area, the plateau region, and the prediction from this is that the apparent brightness of more peripheral targets is greater than the apparent brightness to perifoveal targets. So the contradiction is, and you would expect that every psychophysicist would say, well, and actually told me, that's impossible. The apparent brightness of a threshold target must always be the same. But it turns out that's not the same. So this is sort of the observation I made, that at the periphery, you have a much higher brightness of threshold targets compared to near fovea or foveal targets. So that explains then that we have equal apparent brightness throughout the visual field. You can predict that the apparent brightness here and here is better, higher compared to here. Now, what is behind that? Well, why do we want to have, perhaps, in a system that has a foveal vision, apparent brightness or equal constancy of brightness throughout the visual field? Well, it just so happens that we want to operate efficiently in the environment. So optical targets, things, may appear anywhere in the visual field. So you want to attend efficiently and fast to anything where it may come up. So we never can predict where something is going to happen. So in order to have equal probability to pay attention to anywhere in the visual space, so you want to equalize brightness. You do not want to have a visual system where it's darker, always going to the periphery. When I look around, actually it's always the same brightness, right? So, but this has to be constructed. And the point is, because the oculomotor behavior is controlled at the midbrain, it makes, from the ethological sense, is interesting or important to create a machinery already at the retina to create constancy of brightness throughout the visual field. So to the best of my knowledge, this is my question, research on summation properties of retinal ganglion cells in primates as a function of eccentricity do not exist. There are some studies on cat retina, but the prediction is here, now we have a spontaneous firing frequency, so we have let's say this is a normal gain function. And in the periphery, when you go to periphery, the prediction is that you might have a nonlinearity so that when you come to a threshold, you jump to a higher level. So that then on this area here and this area here, you have parallel summation curves, so that just creates an equally brightness throughout the visual field. But these studies do not exist. Yeah? So this is then my question. Yeah? Is it all wrong, what I'm saying? Maybe it is. So the hypothesis comes from here. The homogeneity of visual space, which we all take for self-evident, is a necessary illusion being based on constancy of brightness throughout the visual field. And the homogeneity of visual space allows equal probability to allocate attention and to operate efficiently in the world, to program cyclic eye movements to anywhere where something may happen. I come to my second example, color induction at the retinal level. Now I invite you to do experiments. Please fixate this point here for 10 seconds. Fixate here, well, 10 seconds, it's a picture of Miro. And now you look over here, and you probably will have a very nice after image superimposed on the name. That's nice, okay? So this is an attempt to somehow break the symmetry of the scientific discourse. Now, Kandinsky, a similar thing you can do also if you fixate here for 10 seconds or so, and then you can look over here and create in the after image, put the name Kandinsky into the light, founder together with others of the abstract art some 100 years ago. Now I make a side remark on lateralized art. When you visit the museum, sort of with an open mind, I would say, what you observe is this famous picture here by Goya, or another picture by Manet. I talk about lateralized art. Or you have this here by Albrecht Dürer, this is from Munich. Or you have one Dali, who was just mentioned, and Ingres, and Rousseau, and Manet again. Now, for those who do not know exactly how the visual field is represented in the brain, everything that is left goes to the right hemisphere, everything was right goes to the left hemisphere. It just so happens, if you look at pictures that have some emotional impact, with much higher probability, the optical center of the picture is on the left side, corresponding more to the right hemisphere. So there is some kind of, let's say, implicit knowledge that somehow guides the artist to somehow focus the optical center on one side. Well, the typical remark then of art historians is, okay, this depends on the direction of writing and all that. But it just happens also the same in Asian art. If you go, for instance, in Beijing, I've done this, you look at the pictures there, the pictures have also this asymmetry, and more symmetrical pictures like, let's say, Paul Klee have a much less, let's say, emotional impact. So if you want to communicate some kind of stronger emotion, you do this. Now, let's go back then, well, I can jump over this, to the case, the scientific case. Let's have an experiment again. I need your cooperation in this case. So please look at this point here. And so make sure that this is white. Okay, now you look over here and fixate this point for about, well, 10 seconds. You have done so. Now, if you look back here, you have a complementary after image in the frame, but you have induced the color, yeah, the green, in the center. Now it has disappeared again. Let's try it again, fixating here. And the induced color is the green in the center. Now, if you do some kind of internal controlled psychophysics, if you fixate here, and then you look over here, you again have also a after image, an induced color, but the induced color is a little bit different compared to this here. So because there was red, it has a movement towards gray. Is that so? If you, well, some people see it like this. Now we do a following experiment. We find out where is color induction actually done. Is it in the brain, cortex somewhere, V4, or is it already in the retina? So what one can do, one just takes a patient who is blind, who does not have any information on the right side of the brain. So the patient has no visual field in this area, and we do exactly the same experiment with a patient who does not process the information on the right side in the visual field. And you get exactly the same effect compared to this here. So in other words, as the information does not reach the cortex, it must be on the retinal basis that this information, this color induction, is created. So what might be the mechanism behind it? Well, this is just from a publication. The prediction is, because it is in the retina, and this is my question now, or presumably in the retina, because of the lateral connections, it should presumably be on the level of amacrine cells, not of, let's say, in the earlier phases in the retina, because the amacrine cells are known to have lateral connections. Now, but because of the color induction effect, it's predicted that there must be a special wave bands of lateral interactions on the retinal level. So in the induction phase, what we are doing in the fatigue phase, when we fatigue here, the periphery, we reduce the inhibition within one color channel so that in the white light here, you have a higher representation because of the lack of inhibition from the lateral green areas in this area. So there is a disbalance, the inhibitory network, presumably network in the retina, that somehow stabilizes the colors, and presumably in the retina. So that's the point I wanted to make here. Well, this relates to Edwin Land and his color theory. I do not go into detail here. So the hypothesis is, at the level of amacrine cells, a lateral network of inhibitory control is implemented. And the lateral inhibitions in this network are bandwidth specific. To the best of my knowledge, I've talked to some people, retinal physiologists and anatomists. This is not, actually it's not studied. So there's some lack of interaction perhaps. I come to my next example, temporal dynamics in cubes, cubism, and binocular rivalry. So this is a so-called this Necker cube. And I actually ask you to participate now in an experiment again. So you see this cube in two different dimensions, right? So let me try this. This one here is now front. Can you do it? And now you switch intentionally to the other perspective. Now this is in front. So do it. You practice this a little bit. Most people can do it. And if you can do it, then you can do it also with this figure here. It's a double Necker cube. And if you try out, you have 7 different kind of possibilities to see this, which requires some kind of, well, intense also training. But one can do it. It's interesting that this, and it's known actually, that people in Cubism studied visual psychophysics at that time. Actually, there are papers where Picasso did it in detail. But look, for instance, here at Paul Klee. What you do when he does that, he creates one picture, but because of the switching back and forth, there's some kind of internal dynamics in the picture, so that you have more pictures and in an unpredictable way, what you see. Another example would be from Klee here, or from Feininger. Or let's look at the temporal dynamics. Now we need an experiment. You see either, let's say, we are talking about the mouse model here. Now we have a mouse, okay? Okay. So who can see a mouse? Can I have your hand? Well, that's very good. And who can see a man? Not everybody. Well, the man, well, this is some kind of arrogant professor, yeah? His glasses, his nose, no hair. Yeah. Who can see the professor? Okay, now I do the following. I tell you what to see. Yeah? Man, mouse, man, mouse. Who can do that? Who follows me? Man, mouse. Perfect. Now let's do it faster. Man, mouse, man, mouse, man, mouse. Still can do it? No. 500 milliseconds. It's a minimal time, then it breaks down. So the minimal time to have conscious control of something you see is around half a second. This is an approximate number. Now do the following. If I tell you now, you're allowed only to see the mouse. Yeah? You are no longer, when I see with an intense voice, now, mouse, you are not allowed to see the man anymore. Is that clear? Well, okay, are you ready? Now. So who got the mouse now? Raise your hand. You got the mouse, yeah? Yeah, you see automatically, if we do a nice experiment, after a few seconds, automatically it switched over to the other alternatives. So if there are two alternatives present, it's impossible, apparently, to keep just one. So this indicates some kind of temporal dynamics, a few second range. Now, this phenomenon of temporal dynamics is also seen, for instance, in binocular rivalry. There are a lot of experiments. Nikos Logothetis has done a lot on binocular rivalry with monkeys. And it shows that there is a spontaneous reversal rate in binocular rivalry of a few seconds duration. So what you do, you have on one eye, the left eye, you see a red grid, horizontal, and the right eye, you see a vertical grid, green. And it switches back and forth in to a few seconds, 3-4 seconds approximately. Now we studied a patient who had tunnel vision, extremely restricted visual field. And he did also have a reversal, but it turned out, and he was reporting and drawing it, that in this situation, he saw this, and then the other picture developed like this. So the red was pushing away the green. So it's that finally you had this here. And this took 20-30 seconds. And then back to the other percept. Now this means there's a temporal dynamic. And if we assume that we have something like a temporal microscope here, we might conclude that in binocular rivalry, but perhaps in visual perception, when you build up a picture, it's not an instantaneous process within a network at the same time or at the same place at the same time, but there's some kind of dynamic, a fast wave perhaps, which is expressed here. The hypothesis, the visual percepts are not built up instantaneously, but sequentially. That is a question, in case this functional microscope can actually be employed. This is my next example. Okay. I don't know, Wolf, did you participate in this one study where we had this patient who had a convergent squint of 17 degrees in his left eye, and when he was about 60 years old, he had a stroke. So the problem then was what's going on in the brain. So we studied the visual field, did some perimetry, and what you see here, this patient has a blindness here. So there's a vertical meridian. You do some visual field measurement, and he's blind here, the lower quadrant. And if you study the left eye, the squinting eye, it turns out that the vertical meridian is shifted approximately by the degree of the squint to the right. So this indicates there is some kind of rigidity of visual field representation shown by normal perimetry. Now the question is, how does the oculomotor system function? So we do a very simple experiment, but it took quite a long time to think about this. Is the oculomotor system really also rigid, or is it plastic? Is that neuroplasticity? And so what could be done, what we did, we occlude the right eye, the good eye, and then we have the situation like this here. So this is the pseudofovea of the left eye, fixating here the optical axis, this point. And this is the projection here of the anatomical fovea here. And then a stimulus is presented. The technology is really a problem here. So we present a target between the projection of the anatomical fovea and the pseudofovea. Now, if the patient uses the anatomical fovea, this is here, he has to look to the left. And if he uses the pseudofovea, he has to look to the right. So he looks to the right always. So he uses the pseudofovea to orient his saccadic eye movements. So there is an adaptation, a plasticity in the oculomotor system, and a rigidity of representation in the visual representation. So a disentangling of the two systems. Now this is, actually it was quite difficult to publish because the ophthalmologist says, this is impossible, one part, and the neurologist said this is impossible for other reasons. But finally it was published. It has 11 reviews with 7 authors, finally. Well, things like this happen. Now, one problem was, and this is actually the more interesting result, I think, if I measure now along the eccentricity up to 30 degrees or so, the sensitivity, and we look at first, let's say here, at the squinting eye, left squinting eye, the blue. So here's a representation of the blind spot. So there's nothing there. And then we have, well, the sensitivity of the foveal axis is still the best. And then here the edge of the scotoma blindness there. But if you look now at the good eye, red eye, the right eye, so what you see here, and this is a surprising thing, there's a dip of sensitivity corresponding to the optical projection of the blind spot on the other eye. So there must be a local interactions for non-corresponding points, presumably in visual cortex. So this implies that there must be a strong divergence of projections and nothing like a point-to-point projection. This is summarized here. So the visual map in V1 is pre-wired and rigid. The oculomotor map is plastic and adaptive. In spite of the rigidity of the central representation of the visual map, local plasticity within the map for non-corresponding retinal points is observed. This is only possible given the high degree of divergence of central projections. Well, I do not know what actually the amount of divergence of projection to V1 is. So the question is, how far do I have to travel in one point in the visual cortex to other areas that I no longer get an input from this area over there? Subcortical control of spatial attention. Well, this is somehow motivated by a publication some 50 or more years ago by Sprague, where he did some research on cats, so ablating one cortex and having blindness, a contralateral field, and then ablating the contralateral superior colliculus and reinstating vision in the cat, and doing then the very nice experiment, cutting the tactile commissure and having the same effect. So this is some of the motivation how we ran in this, these experiments. And so I go here through a study on visual attention implying the subcortical areas. When we talk here about attention in this meeting, well, I think once only was mentioned that the subcortical areas are also important, but usually one talks about the cortical mantle. Now, let's go through this experiment. I hope I can get it somehow clear. So we take a healthy subject. This is his visual field, blind spot, and this here we stimulate, measure continuously threshold, so here's a sensitivity, at this position. And what you get is some kind of habituation effect. This is a phenomenon called Troxler phenomenon, known since 200 years actually. So the sensitivity goes down, then you have a break here, and then you have a spontaneous recovery to a normal. It takes about 20 minutes. That is a normal observation. But now we do the following, and now comes direction break. We do the same experiment, but then the contralateral situation in the visual field is indicated blue, is stimulated, measured here, and they have an immediate recovery. So the threshold goes immediately back to normal, it's shown here, and it goes down then. And now we do the following experiment. We do it with a patient who does not get input to the other hemisphere. So we have again here the habituation effect. We have contralateral stimulation, but the patient does not see it. And then again, have an immediate facilitation effect. And the control experiment is, of course, you do an experiment with a retinal injury, optic tract injury. So you habituate, do it, no effect. So that indicates there must be something behind it, like presumably network, which sort of is a sketch here, that we have this is the retina, perifoveal region. We have a projection, of course, to the LGN, to V1. But the periphery has a stronger projection to the collicular superior. We have a strong inhibitory interaction between the colliculi, and then you have a parallel pathway to cortical areas. And then there's, of course, the important projection back of V1, retinotopically organized to the colliculus. So this somehow, this network, which is behind it. And then we started to study, well, is there an effect of the attention mechanism? Yeah? Do we actually process or have attention in the same way to perifoveal regions on the periphery, because the anatomical representation is different? So what has been done using the experimental paradigm of inhibition of return? So you attend to an area, and then you reattend, and there's an inhibition to return, which is expressed in a prolonged reaction time. So we have acute reaction times. The reaction times are given here. And then we have a perifoveal region. We have an inhibition of return effect, which is indicated here. And then for the periphery, we have a larger inhibition of return effect. So this has been verified with many different paradigms now. So there's indeed some kind of different attentional machinery for the periphery and for the perifoveal region. This has been done with fMRI and MEG and EEG and whatever. So this is a stable phenomenon. So we have two attentional systems. Now we can use, and this is some kind of, in psychophysics, cognitive psychology, an interesting phenomenon. When do we usually do our experiments? Well, when the students, the undergraduates have time, right? Yeah. So the time of day, the circadian phase is usually not recognized. So what we have done, this is done in China, in Beijing, Peking University. We study it every 3 hours, the phenomenon of attention. Yeah? And what you observe is, and this is quite surprising, this is a curve of the inhibition of return for 7 degrees eccentricity. Yeah? And then we do the same thing in the evening. And what you see is we have two attentional systems, one a morning system, yeah, more object-oriented, and the evening system, more perhaps space-oriented. So this is a different machinery. Now, this is a special result, but the more interesting result is, I think, where you're referring to the circadian phase. We can use a circadian clock, actually, to disentangle cognitive functions using the phase relationship between the different functions. this is actually a new paradigm one should use, I think, more in this field. Now, I need your cooperation again. An experiment in attention. Please participate with attention. I really need your cooperation now. Yeah? Are you ready? It takes approximately half an hour. So, divide up this figure into 4 identical parts. And who has a solution, raise her or his hand. So you are not allowed to participate. Well, the normal mathematician and physicist in our university takes half an hour to solve this problem. Yeah? It's not so well. I speed this up a little bit. So this is not a solution, okay? Because this is bigger than this, okay? No, it's not a solution. Who has a solution now already? Getting more. Okay, this is good. Now all those who work on fractals and all that know, of course. Now this is a solution, okay? Now comes the second part of this experiment. Now really pay attention to this. Now divide this figure up into 5 identical parts. Who does not have a solution, raise your hand. Raise your hand, raise your hand, raise your hand, please. Okay, good. So this is a solution, okay? So that was an experiment on attention, right? So that's, you create a frame of reference, and it's amazing. If I would have asked like this at first, I would think, what is this nonsense, yeah? So you carry over the cognitive frame to so actually this is the paradigm of science, yeah? We are always sticking within our paradigms, and to step out, coming from the Western to the Eastern, from the Eastern to the Western. I think to understand the different frames of reference, I think this is why I thought this example should be given. So hypothesis now referring to the experiment. Spatial attention is also controlled in the midbrain level. Cognitive process, the process can be disentangled by using circadian rhythms, phase differences being the critical parameter. I think this really should be harvested in this kind of research. Example 6 is a very short residual vision or blind sight. For those who are not familiar with this phenomenon, it has been shown that patients who have suffered a brain injury, like say the projection towards V1 or the stroke in this area, and who are legally blind, so this is a blind area here, so this, they still can process information. What they can do when you present a target there and you indicate there was a target by giving an auditory signal at one constant place, they can actually direct the saccadic eye movements, their eyes to the target. It's not exact, but it's, well, it can be actually trained. And then particularly in Oxford, Larry Weisskranz and Alan Cowie, they did a lot of studies on that, and that you can discriminate colors and simple forms and all that. Now, we did this, well, started in 1971. It was interesting to publish this paper. Well, after you're referring to this blind, I think it was practically impossible. We sent it to Nature, and it said, this is nonsense. Everybody knows it doesn't work. Then we sent it to Science, that is also nonsense. But then we learned something, keep it in the mail, send it again. So we did all the experiments again, all the control experiments, sent it again to Nature, and then it was immediately accepted. But it was really a hard time to get this going. Now, I show this for one reason. There is no indication for me that there's conscious vision if V1 is completely gone. So V1, in my, this is already the hypothesis, V1, it's just implications of residual vision blind sight. It's important with respect to implicit processing, rehabilitation of function, and the philosophical discourse of consciousness has really harvested this phenomenon. But the point here I want to make, and I want to be contradicted, visual cortex is the one and only structure being responsible for conscious vision. Now, I don't know whether, maybe it applies also to auditory cortex or somatosensory cortex. So the primary cortices are the crucial structures that create a consciousness in that modality. I know that Zemizeki is very much against that because of his micro-consciousnesses, but I think I would like to be disproved. And to the best of my knowledge, I cannot be disproved to that. Okay, now that's my last example, visual completion across an extended area of blindness. Again, a single case study. So this is a visual field of a patient with a left hemisphere injury affecting the optic radiation. And it's the interesting case here is that the patient has this blindness here, and he has a visual area here and a visual area here. This patient, FS, referred to as actually one of the famous blind sight patients. But I did not do blind sight research with him. I did something else. I brought this patient to the lecture hall and demonstrating how well blindness functions. So the medical students can learn that. And then you show what you do. You show a stick. Yeah? So the patient sees a stick, you present a stick, and then you say, oh, I see something here, and I see something here. So this is what you expect. So you can demonstrate, oh, there's something here, and in between is nothing, because there's blindness. So there are no representation in the visual cortex. And then, by some accident, I used a stick, not a laser pointer. I apparently moved the stick, yeah? And the patient suddenly said, oh, I see the entire stick. Now, this was in the presence of 300 students, so this is a testimony, right? So it turns out that this was an absolute accident. And then, of course, you get, what does that mean? What's going on here? And then we started a series of experiments. Unfortunately, this patient recently passed away. So this is shown here. Now, this is not a completion phenomenon according to Carnicer figures. I show this for two reasons. For one, this is you see this without movement. So in other case, we need movements. But can I ask, who sees a rectangle here? That's good. But who does not see a rectangle? I have to ask this because if there would be somebody, he would immediately be invited to do experiments, because then we are looking for special cases who have specific deficiencies. Yeah? So everything is fine, okay? So we do it, a number of experiments. For instance, here. So you have completion phenomenon across. So this is a standard now. And now you find out, doing some kind of forensic technology, yeah? When does he not complete? Yeah? So it's interesting, when you have a different color above and below this scotoma, there is never a completion. So that implies there must be apparently in some structure a lateral network which is color specific, or let's say has spectral sensitivity. The same spectrum has to be apparently processed. Well, no completion, or these are simple experiments when you just show here, there's nothing, or here, this is interesting. There is no completion when you have local information within the scotoma, so this doesn't work. Or when we do pendular movements, there is no completion. Now, this is interesting with respect to cortical. 3 minutes. I take 5, okay? By the way, your mathematics is not quite okay. I work on major on time and timing. I started. Okay, now people who are into visual cortex, so the extrastriate cortex, you go to the MT region, or whatever the name is, yeah, and we do some kind of, what we observe here is if you have this pattern here, you have vectorial completion. So the patient reports a trajectory so that abstracts from the local features. I think this is, extremely interesting. Now, because of the structure, one can do opaque occluders here, one here, and one here. And so the input goes to one eye, from here to this, and the other part from the other eye. And you have binocular fusion. So that means you must have some kind of, well, it's probably not layer 4 in the visual cortex. It must be beyond, where you have binocular excitation of neurons. So we can do visual field measurements. So we take a stick which is displaced by 0.5 degrees, and then there's no completion when you go beyond 1 degree. So in this perifoveal region, we are going up to 10 degrees only. Apparently, well, the size of the receptive field speaks in the favor of V1 and not other areas where we have larger receptive fields, I think. Now we do an experiment on size constancy. So you give prisms so that the apparent size is changed. And we again have completion, so here and here. So I don't know, something happened here. So you have the apparent size is changed. So that means that the output of a system where size constancy is made is apparently still functional. So there's some idea of size constancy. People think, okay, it's size constancy is made on the object, but there's another possibility that we are doing actually a retransformation of a central coordinate system. Here I invite you for a little experiment in order to convince you. You have to do it. Please look at your hand and move it slowly back and forth, slowly back and forth. And now please restore in your head this size change. Now you do it fast. And when you do it fast, the hand is big and small. If you do it slowly, it's approximately the same size. So what's done here, well, this is a well-known phenomenon that the change of accommodation on the convergence angle goes the parallel pathway to extra straight areas and, in my view, creates a coordinate transformation. So the representation is not with respect to the geometry, but with respect, the coordinate system is changed because of the input from the extraocular muscles, and this is the basis of size constancy. Now this brings me to a side remark that on the perspective in this Western and floating view in Eastern art. So trying again to have a link. There's a big deal in Western culture that the central perspective, starting with Alberti, Leonardo, somehow represents how we see objectively the world. Nothing could be more wrong. This experiment right now shows that we do not see the size according to the geometric law, but we have to create size constancy. So that's one reason why it's wrong. The other one is what you see here in the Bruegel picture. You squeeze in the visual field into a narrow visual field so that, let's say, you see it here probably with a visual angle of 5 or so degrees. So this does not reflect anymore the visual representation in the world. So, and I talked about the two visual systems, the two attentional systems. So somehow these systems are not taken care of. And the third point is that far distance, well, in this Bruegel picture, it's actually much better. Usually you see clear context also at far distance, which is not correct. So that indicates that somehow it's wrong with the idea, but it creates an external point of view towards the picture. This is how the Western view of art. Now, if you go now to Chinese or Japanese landscapes, you have a floating view. So in this case, for instance, here, geometrically, this perspective is impossible, but the floating view invites you to become a part of that picture. It creates an internal point of view. And because of Professor Enrique here, I refer to the Roanji garden. Yeah. So why is that? Why does that have such an impact? I was sitting there for hours at this position. This is, when you sit here in this area, you become a part of the garden. But then if people just run around and count the stones, then you create an external point of view. So you can observe actually how you become a part of the whole or how you can have an external point of view. So I thought I should inject it. Coming back to the patient. Now, is the pathway to create completion a cortical or is it a subcortical pathway? So what one can do is one could do the following. One takes an opaque occluder so that now there is no physical information anymore, and still the patient reports completion. So it can be, well, it's presumably not a parallel pathway. And then, well, looking, is this just what is a mechanism? What could be a mechanism? We do a very simple experiment. The stick is fixed, but now we introduce saccadic eye movements, small angle, such that they create a displacement So what is it? 200 degrees per second movement, yeah? And so you have a displacement. In this case, you also have a completion phenomenon. That means that it's a strictly bottom-up, very simple phenomenon we are dealing with here. So it's only within the perifoveal region. Well, everybody shows fMRI pictures. Yeah? I show one too, okay? So I have two more pictures. So you would predict, of course, well, there must be some kind of interesting activation pattern. So we look at the region of interest, visual cortex. So we take the left visual field, stationary movements, yeah, and moving movements, left visual field. This is a good field, right? And so we have a little activation here in the right occipital area. Yeah? And now you would predict for the completion phenomenon, but not for the movement phenomenon in completion, but not for the stationary targets present in the right hemisphere, in the right visual field, you would predict an activation on the left visual cortex, right? That's what you predict. And what you see is you have an activation, but on the wrong side of the brain, on the right side and on the left side. Same like here, yeah? So this is a very strange thing. And so we try to think about it, and this is then my question to this. How is it possible that the information travels to the other side of the brain? So we assume there is some kind of neuronal activation across the corpus callosum to the ipsilateral side. Other hypothesis may be possible. I'll explain it in a minute. So the eastern view would be the other hypothesis. Let's leave it in a state of indefiniteness. And the western view, well, you have to disprove the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is the following. So this is a view towards the visual cortex now. This is the representation here of the vertical meridian, VM. This is the area of blindness where it's no input in the left visual cortex. And now when we project the targets here in the upper part and the lower part moving, this is indicated here with a movement. Yeah? So what we create, usually elements are inhibiting each other. Yeah, this is sort of the language of the brain. So when we do not have an input here, so there is no inhibition coming from here. So they are no longer working. So we have a higher activity here. And this then, there's an intercallosal projection of inhibitory nature, as Giorgio Innocenti claims at least. So we have on both sides here, we have a traveling or a projection, an asymmetric projection to the other side of the brain. And here, because of the stronger activation here, we have a reduced inhibition between the elements above, below and above. And this creates, this creates a traveling wave of some kind. Traveling waves are well known, very low frequency, but this may be a time domain, I cannot say anything, so that you create actually on this side of the brain some kind of activation pattern which we observe in the fMRI. So this is the hypothesis which has to be disproven. So I've come to the end. And the summary of hypotheses, in spite of all the criticism that single case studies have, I think it's useful, makes sense to harvest this serendipity. So all these cases came by accident. They were not, you cannot predict. You have to wait. Yeah? You just sit there and you are lucky. Yeah? So this is also probably the characteristics of science, using serendipity and be lucky. Now this is my last picture here. When you work and when you get older, yeah, you recognize just a few names of people, how little one contributes. Yeah? So it's in science, of course, but also you get input from arts, your friends. I do not go to mention all the names, but this person here, Claude Bernard, is for me very important with respect to the concept of homeostasis. Or go to the other corner here, Immanuel Kant, with the three critiques, but right now I think the critique of judgment with respect to art is extremely important. Go to this gentleman here, Descartes with the Discours de la méthode, where he describes the four rules of thinking, that you have to be clear in the mind, you shouldn't have prejudices. I think I've shown it does not work without prejudices. Or let's go here to Professor Janos Santagator again. Here, a group of students from Singapore, of whom I worked several years ago, and other, well, Fechner, Konrad Lorenz. Well, I wanted to show this one. I show also Picasso. Not because he's a painter, but Picasso said, a picture is never finished, a book is never finished, and a lecture is never finished. Thank you very much.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much. But let me ask a little favor. Can you go back 2 slides? Just 2 slides.
You want science?
Yes, 2 slides. Well, more than science. Yes, philosophy. What we have discussed during your talk with Jan. The last 2 sentences. This is what we exactly experience here in the East or in Singapore on a daily basis. So can you explain a little bit your view before we ask the questions? The Eastern view and the Western view. We fully agree with you. Just what is your view on it?
Well, I think basically I cannot and I do not want to comment on that. Because my experience is that I find so many people in the so-called West, called Europe, that represent the Eastern view as it somehow in its character. And the other way around, I would say I'm often now in China, Peking University, people are more Western in their reasoning, as is usually said. So one point is indeed, I think, when studies that there's a greater tendency in the Eastern view. I don't know whether you will agree to that, to look at relations to the Gestalt, the entire thing. And so the Western aspect is more what has been discussed. Wolf has referred to that, to causality. So we want to understand. But you see, take also the trajectory, the parallel trajectory in the Western philosophy. There has always been a parallel strand. It has not always been this rationalistic attitude with Descartes and others. But you see, go to the scholastic time, credo quia absurdum, or credo ut intelligam. I have to believe in order to think. So how is it, what is the structure in our brain, in our mind, that we actually acknowledge the truth of a statement? How do I know that? So there's an intrinsic, let's say, truth or belief in the truth that when we talk. So we do not question all the time when I talk, is he right or wrong? Well, there's an instantaneous trust in the other, trust in the words. I think this is, and maybe and other names can be mentioned. In my real work on the practical level, what I've observed, but this seems to be a cultural artifact, certainly is, I'm surprised that some Chinese students I work with cannot accept their own thinking. So that go to Immanuel Kant in 1784, he wrote this famous, What is Enlightenment? So you trust your own, you have to learn to trust your own thinking. Aude sapere, dare to think. I would say dare to act, aude agere. And so, but some people, this must be some kind of education, well, China, I don't know how in other countries, that you never actually question the professor. You learn, and then you give your, but you don't have an opinion. It's sort of canonical knowledge. This is sort of the power of the textbook. And this is actually, in a certain sense, a disaster. I know that the new government, Xi Jinping, says we have to be more innovative, more creative. To overcome this means, of course, well, you have to understand their culture, that there's another way. So I'm not saying let's mix it all up, but understand the learning that we have these different attitudes, these different frames within which we operate. And this is actually, for me, the creativity also, that I can cooperate with them is very different, in certain aspects. I would say often people say Germans are deep thinkers. No, well, this is nonsense. Maybe some. I experience very deep thinking, slow and deep thinking in Japan, in China. So this is more, let's say, conversation with a glass of wine.
Questions?
everybody's exhausted. Good.
Yes, please.
Could I just give my perspective on what you're talking about, the Eastern and Western view? The Eastern view is really not indefinite. It is a high context culture where the assumptions are taken for granted. In the West, it's a low context where you really dissect. You have to understand the sentence in the context it's written. So I think that's where the whole difference is. It's not an issue of indefiniteness in the Eastern view. It's really that it's a high context culture. I can say a few things in a few words, and you know exactly what I mean. But you have to go deep into the culture to understand that.
Yeah, but there's no problem with that. We have the same thing. A poem, in a Western culture expresses exactly that. By the way, I cite in this case a Japanese philosopher. So the problem is right now here, we use language, and this gentleman here actually adores Wittgenstein #1, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and there claims you can actually express everything in language. That is not possible, however we communicate. So you made a statement, but I agree, of course, to that. Why should I not? But many different ways to talk about around these things. I think everything is much closer than we usually imply.
Yeah, I would like to second what you said. My impression from, I'm just finishing a book with a Buddhist monk, and so I got used to this way of thinking, and I think what I sense, but it may be wrong, and the N is small. It's not a scientific statement, but in your culture, the Eastern culture, the notion of embeddedness, of mutual dependence, of the impossibility to isolate whatever phenomenon out of context, to analyze it without destroying it, is much stronger as in our culture, where we have the impression that, well, if you take a molecule out of context, it will still remain the molecule, and we can analyze it and then describe it, and that's it. My feeling is that, but I need your opinion, that you probably sense that if one dissects this and takes it apart, the individual element loses also part of its previous identity, because it can only be explained by the interconnectedness. And it seems to be the same at the societal level, but I may be completely wrong.
Maybe I can inject here another idea. The problem in these discussions is so-called of the disease we all share. This is monocausalitis. We try to explain something with one reason, one context only. And so I try to favor the concept of complementarity as a generative principle, as a thought pattern. So take, for instance, art. We just wrote a paper on Western, Eastern art. I think you have the gestalt, but complementary, you need the relations between the elements, And you don't have to, this is actually necessary. Complementarity is a necessary concept as a thought pattern, I would say. So we should not play a game against each other.
Oh, question over there.
I just wonder if I could add to the conversation, the flow that, and maybe another way, I'm just wondering if one could look at it this way between West and East, and it seems it's interesting there seems to be a convergence and a divergence. I think the convergence seems to be, as you say, the students in China are becoming much more sort of deterministic, in the West becoming slightly non-deterministic. Science has become from sort of Laplace clockwork universe to sort of Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So there seems to be a sort of movement in science away from this deterministic black and white to a sort of very quite confusing contextual complexity. I mean, that's why we're here. We're talking about complexity science, which seems to be anew. Whereas if you look at some of the ancient religions, especially in China, for example, Taoism, that contextualization of yin and yang being together and yet separate seems to be embedded. So I'm just wondering if there's a sort of religious stroke scientific boundary that is becoming blurred, and that has led to, firstly, this view of the East as East and the West as West on the one hand, and yet at the same time we seem to be having a convergence. It'd be interesting to see what you think.
Well, I think the problem is that we try to make it simple, but too simple. Yeah? That is exactly what you refer to Heisenberg. The quantum mechanics, the complementarity concept, is a descriptive, not a generative principle. So that's a big difference in biology. Take brain science. So this is a complementarity as a, let's say, bottom-up, top-down, a complementary complement principle as a generation, the creative principle. That's very different, I would say. Now, with respect to, so we have the tendency to ontologize all the time. So make it, well, prejudices are necessary, apparently, to be fast. So this creates, of course, this nonsense of talking, making stupid remarks about the other cultures. I think the unbelievable thing is that you create immediately an empathic relationship to other people. You do not understand the language. When I was in the Amazonas region and met people, Yanomami Indians, you immediately have a link. Yeah? You understand, oh, we have to use human language. So the explicit language, which we use here in scientific discourse, actually separates us much more as it should.
So you'd agree then the Eastern view being, let's keep it in a state of indefiniteness, and the Western
well,
view
this is just a citation. I do it too.
You know, we all fall into the same trap, but there is a deeper, you know, the opposite of a truth is a falsehood. The opposite of deep truth is another deep truth. So maybe there is a sort of dynamic here which is worth exploring.
Well,
so rather than talking
the
about the boundary,
it's
how they go together.
Truth, the word we cannot use. You see, if you do something, you mentioned that you have an experiment that you immediately lays eggs, and you have more questions. So we are always, I think, as serious scientists, in the state of indefiniteness. And it takes courage to accept the next step. You know? But
questions? Yes.
With what we have been exposed to, as well as the internet, with the explosion of knowledge, will we lead to what I call a total collapse of knowledge? I want your view on that. Thanks.
We have a collapse of knowledge?
A total collapse of knowledge. Because if we are, you see, if one really want to be a true scientist, you are saying that this is work in progress.
Yeah.
So if everybody is all relative, will we get into a space where we actually have lead to a total collapse of knowledge?
Well, I could not disagree more than so we are talking about, let's say, what the education system and how. So of course we had to learn more content. The Encyclopedia Britannica by heart. So this is content. What we learn now is that you have to navigate through knowledge systems. That means you must have a landscape of what kind of knowledge exists. So my educational program, actually, which I promote, is modern education or knowledge is based on three things. So you have to be a specialist. You have to learn one thing, and you should say, I'm the best in the world to do exactly that. However, now, I have to know at the same time a landscape of potential knowledge that other people may also have. The deficiency in education system in our country, at least, is that we do not work towards this landscape of, in fact, also canonical knowledge. So we have to know where something is, so that we can navigate through all these spaces. And if you have the two, if I'm a specialist and modest and proud and do something, and have a knowledge landscape, I get the third thing, which is sort of comes from the Enlightenment, is the respect towards the others, because I cannot know what you know. So that creates then the openness of discourse which we have. So I think this is the modern technology, I think, really empowers this, and we should work towards it and not think, I will not say that there are also a lot of stupid people around. This is, and of course, we are all lazy, yeah? But this is another issue. Yeah?
Yes, Ruud.
The ambiguous figure that you showed, the man red, there are many of those figures. Well, in the early 70s, there was a notion that the viewer to these figures, at the point of entry of the figure, could determine proactively what he would see or she would see. Is that still the idea?
I must say that I do not get the point.
So I mean, you asked us what you see, either a rat or a mouse or a man. Well, there were experiments in the early 70s that showed that people could be predicted what they were going to
Oh, yeah,
say,
yeah. No,
depending on where,
sure,
where
yeah.
you entered the figure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I could have conditioned you. That I actually do it in a class with students. Yeah?
Yeah.
I tell a story, and then everybody is going to see a mouse. Yeah? Although the word mouse is not even mentioned. So this is you can create a frame of perception. Well, this is yeah,
Now,
sure.
I refer to experiments where volunteers were totally fixed in a machine where only their eyeballs could move. And you show a picture for 500 milliseconds, 10 pictures in a row, and you ask them later on what they saw, and you can see where they have looked at because their eye movements are going 50 times a second. And then what turned out was that you could predict on the basis of the computer outcome what they would say, what they would have seen.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that is a well-known effect.
Final question for the session? Peter, you used to ask questions. So in this case, I have to thank, well, before I thank Ernst, I have to tell you something important. So tomorrow afternoon, we have a little tiny small change in the program, because at 3:30, one of our best friends in Singapore, I mean, I talk on behalf of Jan and myself, Professor Sidney Brenner will arrive, and he would like to give a short half-an-hour talk. So it's around 3:30, 3:45, so we will probably have a shorter coffee break tomorrow afternoon to give the floor to Sidney and then Henrik's lecture. So I would like to thank you, Ernst, for this brilliant, priceless enterprise.
Thank you.